Epictetus' Discourses begin in Book 1, Chapter 1 by talking about what's in our power and what's not in our power. And that's a very important topic for the Stoics and for Epictetus, but that's not where we're actually going to begin. We're going to start in Book 2, Chapter 11, talking about the origin or the beginnings of philosophy as Epictetus understands it, because we're involving ourselves in this activity along with him of doing philosophy, of trying to see things through his vision on the world, on values, on human nature. So it's probably good to have a solid understanding of what he understands this whole project to be. Now, you notice I've got these three sets of topics here, and we'll come to them fairly soon. I do want to give you a little bit of preview. These are the things that Epictetus says this is really what philosophy is about according to us Stoics. These three main studies. There he's differing with a lot of other philosophers and even with some of the other Stoics who had focused on logic more or had focused more on investigating nature. He's very concerned. This does concern logic a bit. But it primarily concerns what we'd call ethics and philosophy of human nature. A little bit of epistemology as well. We'll come back to that. Let's talk about how do we get doing this whole philosophy business in the first place. So let's contrast Epictetus to another philosopher, Aristotle. Aristotle had famously said that philosophy begins in wonder, or awe, you could call it, or amazement. And amazement at what? At the things that we encounter, like, looking at the universe. We're, wow, what is this? And we want to figure out what's actually going on there. That's not where everybody began philosophy. For somebody like Socrates, philosophy began with a much more humble and human endeavor. And you can say the same thing about Epictetus. When he talks about how does philosophy begins, he's got two passages where he tells you about this. The first place he says, the beginning of philosophy, to him at least who enters in it on the right way, because you can enter into it many different ways, and by the door, as opposed to going in the window or digging up from below or something like that, is a consciousness of his own weakness and inability about necessary things. Now, doesn't that strike you as kind of strange to say? A consciousness of our inability and our weakness about necessary things. Epictetus is saying we need to think things out precisely because we find ourselves in a mess. And we don't just find ourselves in a mess in a situation that's a mess. We find ourselves to be a mess, and we want to know, how did things get this way? And if we want to do that, we're going to require some standard for not being so screwed up, for not having things so backwards or mixed up. And that standard can't just be our feelings or our self-esteem or our desires. It's got to be something else. Some of it will come from within us, but some is going to come from teaching as well. He says we come into the world with no notion about a whole bunch of things. For example, geometry. We have to be taught geometry in school. But as to good and evil, beautiful and ugly, what's appropriate or inappropriate, what's proper and improper, happiness and misfortune, what we ought to do, what we ought not to do, who ever came into the world without some sort of idea about these? We all have some sort of what he's calling preconceptions, proleipsis in Greek. You can understand these as being sort of born in us, or you can understand it as we all encounter an environment that imposes some basic conceptions upon us. But these are vague. Good and evil. We think all sorts of things are good and evil. We're not even consistent with ourselves over time quite often. We have these really basic notions, these preconceptions. But are they being applied correctly? Do we know what to do with them well? Or are we misapplying them? When we get to particulars, which is where we live, where we make decisions, actual, real, existing things, or the things that we imagine, are we getting the application right, or aren't we? I mean, if we think about our own experience, and we've put it in these sort of terms, haven't we often screwed up? Great example. Preconception of what a friend is supposed to be like. We think somebody's our friend. We get down to the particulars. Turns out they weren't our friend. They screw us over. We feel bad as a result. We're angry. We're upset. We're sad. We're hurt. We overreact, and then the next time around we refuse to make ourselves vulnerable to the next person who comes along, still operating out these preconceptions. And we're never going to get away from preconceptions, by the way. We need these. We need them in order to be able to make sense out of reality, according to Epictetus. But applying them to particulars is something that isn't innate to us. Applying them well to particulars, I should say. And we want to figure out how we should do this. He goes on a little bit more, and he says, this is the beginning of philosophy, a perception of the disagreement of human beings with each other. What's going on there? Well, we all come into the world with these preconceptions, and what might happen in the case of the false friend, right? I have a preconception of friendship, they have a preconception of friendship. These preconceptions don't disagree with each other. As a matter of fact, they kind of map onto each other, but they're loosey-goosey. They're not quite definite. They are general. You can put a lot of different things into these boxes that are these preconceptions. And then when it comes to actually applying things to particulars, I find out that, I thought that a friend shouldn't, for example, and this is not a case that's happened to me, thank God, shouldn't use my credit card, and this other person over here thinks that friends should share and share alike, and they get to use my credit card and run it up very high. And now we have a conflict. Now I say, you're not really a friend, and they say, oh yes I am, we're friends. And now we have a disagreement. Now philosophy begins when we get enough of these disagreements that we start saying, I gotta figure this out. But it doesn't just stop there with disagreement and identifying, this sort of structure. He says, a perception of the disagreement of people with each other and an inquiry into the cause of the disagreement and a condemnation and distrust of that which only seems, and a certain investigation of that which seems, whether it seems rightly, and a discovery of some rule, as we have discovered a balance in the determination of weights, and a carpenter's rule, he means a measuring tape, in the case of straight and crooked things. This is the beginning of philosophy. So philosophy doesn't just begin by noting that there's conflict, and it doesn't just begin by saying, well, now we understand why there's conflict. We've got the same basic ideas, but when it comes to how we flesh those ideas out, you and I aren't on the same page, and we get down to the nitty-gritty, the particulars, where we live, you and I are in disagreement with each other. It doesn't stop there, because you can ask, well, who's right? Is anybody right? Are we all just crazy? Are we just making stuff up as we go along? How do I know how I actually ought to live? Think about, again, these key issues. We all have ideas of the good and the evil, the beautiful and the ugly, the moral and the immoral, the noble and the base, the becoming and the unbecoming, the appropriate and the inappropriate, happiness, misfortune, all these sorts of things, what we ought to do, what we ought not to do. These are important things for us to figure out. And if all we have is a world full of disagreements, where are we going to turn? What we need is some sort of rule for figuring these things out. We need something to measure whether we're actually getting the applications right, and how much progress needs to be made yet. We need a standard by which we can make sense of things. Where are we going to find that? He says, let's think about other areas of life. Do we have to say that all things are right, which seems so to all? How is it possible contradictions can be right? Not all then, but which seem to us be right. Well, different people think different things are right. So what are we going to get for that rule? He says, there's got to be some rule. So he gives us an example. He says, what is the matter presented to us about which we're inquiring? Pleasure. Let's think about pleasure. We all feel pleasure, right? Now let's subject it. What is really pleasant? What should we want to feel? He says, subject it to the rule, throw it into the balance. Ought the good to be such a thing that it is fit that we have confidence in it? Yeah, we get people to agree to that. And in which we ought to confide? Yeah. Is it fit to trust to anything which is insecure? Probably not. Is pleasure anything secure? Now that I think about it, notice, I have to say, now that I actually think about it a little bit, turns out that's not the case. If I'm just going with my gut reactions, I'm condemned to being stuck here. But as a human being, we're able to reflect upon this and gradually make our way to some sort of rule or standard. So he says, to philosophize is this, to examine and to confirm the rules, to figure out what we need to actually get straight about. So we're going to look at a few different things with respect to this. Let's look at chapter 17 of book 2 now. This is about preconceptions, or he's calling them there in the translation, how we're applying preconceptions to particular cases. It says, what is the first business of the person who's philosophizing? Now notice he's bringing in something new. If we want to be able to find the rule and we want to be able to apply it, we have to look at the kind of people that we are. We can't just sort of get it from the outside and start applying it the way that you might by ordering some product. It's got to become part of who we are. So he says, to throw away self-conceit. Now what does it mean to throw away self-conceit? That means to not think that we always have it right, but to be willing to see if there's something else that might be more right than us that we would have to subject ourselves to. Why? He says, well, it's impossible for somebody to begin to learn what they think that they already know. You can't teach somebody who already thinks that they know it all, because there's literally no room in their mind for you to put anything else, for them to learn anything else. Again, we have to, if we want to do philosophy, we have to be honest about our own condition, about the fact that we don't have it all figured out ahead of time. So he says, as to things about, what ought to be done and what ought not to be done, all of us go talking of them at random, and then we go to the philosophers. So we go and we read Plato and we read Aristotle, and we read Epictetus and we read other people. And we buy books and we put them on the shelf. And on these matters we praise, we censure, we accuse, we blame, we judge and determine about principles honorable and dishonorable. But why do we go to the philosophers? Why did Epictetus go to Musonius Rufus? Why, if you're actually really into this, why would you go to a philosopher? Because we want to learn what we think we don't know. Well, what is that? He says, it's not possible to adapt preconceptions that we have to their correspondent objects if we've not distinguished them, if we've not inquired what object must be subjected to each preconception, if we're not actually looking at the world that we live in and paying attention to it and distinguishing it. And this world that we live in doesn't just mean things outside of us. It also includes our reactions to them and how we relate ourselves to those things. And then we also have to look at, are we applying things right? Or maybe are other people applying things better than we are? Do they have a better conception of how to do this? So he says, he gives an example of this again. Who among us doesn't speak of good and bad, useful and not useful? Who doesn't have a preconception of each of these things? If you wonder, do we talk about this sort of stuff? How did you end up in college? How did you end up studying this material, watching this video? You had a conception of what was good for you. And as you begin to apply it to particular cases, you start saying, I should actually watch this video. That would be a good thing for me. It might not be, good thing, just for your own development or something like that. I need to pass this class. And if I want to pass this class, I got to learn the material. And this is a useful way of learning the material. You carried out a reasoning process. You're all carrying out reasoning processes all the time about what's good and bad, right and wrong. You're making judgments constantly. If anybody tells you not to be judgmental or not to make judgments, they're probably manipulating you or blinding you, because you do need to actually make some judgments and you need some preconceptions in order to do that, but you want to make sure they're actually the right ones. So he goes on and he says, apply the preconception to the particular things. Does not one man adopt the preconception of good to, when we're talking about particulars, to wealth, and another not to wealth but pleasure and health? Different people are oriented towards different goods, right? And they all have the preconception of what's really good for us, but when you get down to the particulars and the application that they're making of it, they come up with different answers. How do you figure out which one is right? How do you come up with a rule? Test them. Walk them through. Somebody thinks that wealth really is the best thing in the world. Think about wealth. Think about what you can do with it. Think about what you can't do with it. Think about, how it's an external thing to us and can be taken away just like that. And look around and see whether wealth really does, in fact, make people happy, or whether it's the things that they can buy with it that they think make them happy, and see whether those actually make them happy or not, or whether happiness consists in something else. So he says, if you actually properly adapt your preconceptions, you're not going to be unhappy. You're not going to be hindered. So that is a key topic to think about. He says, let's put aside the other topics about pursuits and study of the duties. Let's omit the third topic. I'm going to give you those. Let's insist on the first topic. And now you realize we're already starting to get into the course of study. What is the first topic? He says, it presents an almost obvious demonstration that we don't properly adapt preconceptions. Do you now desire that which is possible and that which is possible to you? If so, why are you hindered? Why are you troubled? If you actually have your desires and your aversions right in how you've thought it, you're applying this basic preconception that you've got about what's good and bad or desirable or undesirable, if you're actually applying that right, why isn't your life already as good as it can be? So that means that you need to look at desires and aversions. You need to actually study them. You need to think about them. You need to do some judging. You need to start saying, maybe this desire that I have is not a good desire for me, and maybe this aversion that I have is not a good aversion for me. And then, after you've realized that, well, what do you do? How do you change that? Well, he goes on and he tells us several other things as well. This is in book 3. He says there's 3 things in which a man ought to exercise himself who would be wise and good. When he says man, translate human being, because it's anthropos. It means human being, not necessarily male gender. The first concerns the desires and aversions. Why? So that you won't fail to get what you desire, and so that you won't fall into what you are averse to. The second concerns movements towards and movements from an object, and in general, doing what a person ought to do, so that you can act according to order, to reason, and not carelessly. The third concerns freedom from deception and rashness and judgment, and generally, it concerns the assents. Now he says, which of these is the most important? This one. Because that, I'm going to do a little bit of erasing here, that doesn't just concern desire and aversion in the sense of turning towards or away from something. It also has to do with what he calls the affects. And when you see affect, think emotion or mood or attitude. When you get angry because you're averse to something that somebody imposed upon you, or you're averse to the thing being imposed on you in the way that it was, or the fact that they overlooked you, or that they hindered you. And you have a desire to retaliate. Anger can be understood as not only a set of beliefs, and not only a feeling, but also desires and aversions. Anger arises because our desires and aversions are vexed or crossed. Same thing with sadness. Same thing with fear. Same thing with all these emotions that we can think of. So he says, an affect is produced in no other way than by failing to obtain what a person desires or falling into what a person would wish to avoid. That's what brings in perturbations, getting upset, disorders, bad fortune, misfortunes, sorrows, lamentations, and envy. That's what makes people envious and jealous. And by these causes, we're unable to listen to the precepts of reason. Reason is what makes us the kind of beings that we are. So then he says, the second topic concerns the duties of a person. I don't want to just be free from affects like a statue. I want to actually be an active person who does the things that I ought to do. I ought to maintain the relations natural and acquired as a pious person, a son, a father, a citizen. The third topic, he says, is that which immediately concerns those who are getting somewhere. That which concerns the security of the other two. And it has to do with what we should give assent to, what we should agree to, and what we might get deceived by. So this has got some epistemology and some logic parts there, you know. Epictetus says, a lot of people want to begin philosophy here, like with a critical thinking class or something like that, and they don't pay attention to getting this stuff right. This is really sort of the icing on the cake. This is what consolidates these other two. But people want to begin with this. And he says, the present philosophers, they neglect the first two. They employ themselves on the second, they employ themselves on the third, and they get, nowhere as a result. He says, have you successfully worked out the rest? Here's some examples again. Are you free from deception in the matter of money? Do you really understand what money is about and whether it can make you happy or not? If you see an attractive person, do you resist the appearance? If a neighbor obtains an estate by will, somebody succeeds, somebody wins the lottery, do you feel envious? He says, now, is there nothing else wanting to you that you're lacking except some unchangeable firmness of mind? You hear these very things with fear and anxiety that some person may despise you, and with inquiries what any person may say about you. And if a person comes and tells you that in a certain question, in which the question was, who's the best philosopher? Somebody who was present said that a certain person was the best philosopher. Your little soul, which was only a finger's length, stretches out 2 feet. So what he's saying is, unless we actually get this stuff figured out, which again has to do with how to apply preconceptions to particulars. Well, that's the key idea. This is providing us with a rule. Unless we actually do that, we're not going to get anything out of this other type of study. And he says, if you want to know what a person is really like, look at their principles, look at what fits in here as what motivates them. We like to think that we're more than just our principles or desires or aversions or motivations. But really, if you want to know who a person is, look at what they desire. Brillat-Savarin said, if you want to know who a person is, look at what they eat. Or we are what we eat in a certain respect, right? And that's true. But we are also what we read, what we watch, what we imitate, who we hang out with, what we place as central to us. And we're not that different from each other in these respects. One person who's money hungry is pretty much the same as another person who's money hungry in how they're going to adapt their preconceptions of the good or the appropriate or the right to particulars and screw it up in the process. One person who's trying to live out a Stoic life is very much like another person who's trying to live out a Stoic life. Doesn't keep them from being individuals, but these are pretty common topics. There's one other thing that he says about this. He's talking about, and this is in chapter 12 of book 3, about exercise. What does exercise mean? Well, when you exercise your body, you're trying to improve it, right? And can you, bench press 250 pounds just by saying, this week I can only bench press 95 pounds, next week it's going to be 250. That's not going to happen. You have to work your way up. It takes a long time. Some people may never be able to do that. Am I going to, I'm never going to run a 5.5 minute mile again like I did when I was 19 years old. This is not going to happen. But, it was just assuming that I was going to be inclined towards running, which I'm not. I can actually, do exercise that will increase my cardiovascular level and strengthen my legs and things like that. But it has to be gradual. He says, since strong habit leads, and we're accustomed to employ desire and aversion only to things which are not in the power of our will, we ought to oppose to this habit a contrary habit. Where there's great slipperiness in appearances, there to oppose the habit of exercise. What would be an example of this? He has the example of pleasure. Great example for me. Love to eat. I love to taste things. I love to cook. I probably eat larger portions than I ought to. Why do I do that? Because I like the pleasure of actually eating the food, most often made by myself. If I want to get better, just as far as my body goes, but also in terms of my self-control and my mind, what I ought to do is oppose the habit that I've already developed of desiring certain things and being averse to certain things. What, we're not going to have dessert? I like to have dessert with dinner, and I have an aversion to not having dessert. That's kind of stupid, isn't it? I could easily say, look, buddy, we're just not going to have dessert for the next month, and by the end of that month, I will probably have changed my aversion so it's not really a problem for me anymore. What gets us to do that? We have to choose it. We have to actually have a desire that bears upon our desires. We have to have an aversion to having crazy aversions. Notice there's some what we call reflexivity there. So he says that if we want to change the way we are, we need to focus not only on acquiring information, we have to actually do some exercise. This is something that we acquire, how to apply preconceptions to particulars well. We acquire that in part by doing it over and over and over again. We need a rule for it, but it's the kind of rule when it comes to these things that's only going to become apparent as such over time. It's not going to be fully apparent to us from the start until we're already engaged in it. That's the beginning of philosophy for Epictetus.